Imagine your own family, the people you raised, the people you love, exiling you from Christmas with a single brutal text message. For Elizabeth, a 72-year-old grandmother, this wasn't just an insult. It was the first crack in a 45-year-old lie, a lie that hid a secret so dark it threatened to consume them all. What happens when a life of quiet sacrifice is revealed to have been a gilded cage? What happens when the prisoner finally decides to break free? Stick with us to uncover a story of devastating betrayal, long-buried secrets, and one woman's final chilling fight for justice. Follow our channel, share this with anyone who has ever felt silenced, and make sure you press that notification bell because you will not believe what she uncovers in the silent rooms of her own home. The scent was the first thing. Pine. Not the sharp artificial blast from a can, but the deep, resinous perfume of a real Douglas fir, its needles still cold from the Oregon air. For Elizabeth, the scent was a key one that unlocked 45 Decembers in this house. Her fingers, though knotted with the fine-boned arthritis of 72 years, moved with an instinct that defied age. They danced through a worn cardboard box labelled Ornaments, Living Room. The tissue paper inside as delicate and yellowed as ancient scripture. Each ornament was a verse in the long poem of her marriage. Here was the fragile glass bird David had bought on their first Christmas in Havenwood, its painted eye now faded to a ghostly grey. Here were the clumsy salt dough handprints of their daughter Sophia from kindergarten, the glitter still stubbornly clinging after all these decades. She hummed a faint, tuneless melody, a half-remembered carol, as she reached for the silver star, the tree's crowning jewel. It was her ritual. The world outside could spin into chaos. Elections, recessions, the endless chatter of the digital age. But in here, in early December, the universe narrowed to this single sacred task. The house Havenwood had been her and David's creation. He had handled the numbers, the investments, the solid, respectable architecture of their life as a successful accountant. She had handled the soul, the Christmases, the birthdays, the Sunday roasts. She was the curator of memories, the quiet keeper of the flame. The fairy lights she'd already strung around the branches blinked in a slow, gentle rhythm, casting pulsing shadows on the walls. They made the familiar room feel magical, consecrated. She lifted the star, its 5 points cool, against her palm, and was about to reach for the small stepladder when her phone buzzed on the mantelpiece. The sound was an intrusion, a shrill, modern complaint against the analog peace of the moment. She hesitated, tempted to ignore it. It was probably just a news alert or a promotional message, but the buzzing persisted, insistent. With a small sigh, she set the star carefully back in its tissue paper nest and walked to the fireplace. It was an older model smartphone, a gift from her son-in-law Mark 2 years ago. "To keep you connected, Elizabeth," he'd said, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. She squinted at the screen, her reading glasses perched on her nose. A message from Mark. Her heart gave a little flutter of warmth. Maybe he and Sophia were confirming what time they'd be over on Christmas Eve to help her with the final preparations. Then she read the words. They weren't long. They were brutally efficient. "Sophia and I think it's best if you celebrate Christmas at your own home this year. The kids are overwhelmed, and your constant negativity isn't helping. We need a positive holiday." Elizabeth read it once, then a second time. The letters seemed to swim, to rearrange themselves, refusing to form a coherent thought. It was like looking at a language she almost knew, but the meaning was monstrous, impossible. Her own home. As if this house, the very heart of their family's Christmas, was now a place of exile. Constant negativity. The phrase echoed in the sudden roaring silence of the room. What negativity? The grief for David, which still sometimes caught in her throat like a shard of glass. was that it was her sorrow now an inconvenience, an administrative problem to be solved by her exclusion. The air left her lungs in a silent gasp. Her hand, the one that wasn't holding the phone, went to her chest, pressing against a pain that was sudden and sharp. She felt the steady, pulsing rhythm of the fairy lights on her skin, but their warmth was gone. Now their blinking felt like a frantic, meaningless signal. On, off, on, off. A mechanical heartbeat in a room that had just died. She looked around the half-decorated space. The scent of pine was no longer comforting. It was cloying funereal. The box of ornaments was a box of relics from a life that apparently no longer existed. Her gaze fell on the small, clumsy handprint ornament Sophia had made. A wave of nausea washed over her. The love she had poured into that child, into this family for a lifetime. Had it all been erased by a single, casually cruel text message, 45 years of being the good wife, the supportive mother, the doting grandmother? 45 years of quiet endurance, of putting their needs before her own, of smoothing over rough patches and keeping the peace. It had all just been adjudicated, weighed, and found wanting. Dismissed. Without thinking, she reached back into the box, and her fingers closed around a delicate, hand-blown glass angel. David had bought it for her in Germany on a business trip. It was her favorite. She lifted it out, its iridescent wings, catching the blinking lights. It was so light, so perfect, a symbol of everything she thought her life had been beautiful, cherished, protected. Her fingers went slack. The angel fell. It didn't make a loud noise, just a sharp, crystalline pop as it hit the hardwood floor, a sound like a tiny bone snapping. She didn't flinch. She just stared down at the glittering dust and the few larger shards of rainbow-tinted glass. A wing here, a piece of a gown there. It was utterly irrevocably shattered, and in the profound, humming silence of her empty, festive house, Elizabeth felt it. This was it. The final cut. The one that severed the last thread of the woman she had been. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of questions she'd never dared to ask. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something stir beneath the pain. It wasn't sadness. It was something colder, harder, and much, much heavier. She didn't sweep up the broken glass. She left it there, a tiny, glittering memorial on the floor. For days, the house remained her silent companion. The blinking lights on the tree eventually felt like an accusation, so she unplugged them, plunging the living room back into the flat, grey light of the Oregon winter. The silence was a physical presence. It filled the spaces between the furniture, seeped into the curtains, and lay heavy on her shoulders like a shroud. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a life well ordered. It was the vast, echoing silence of a tomb. Elizabeth began to wander. She moved through the rooms of the house, not as its owner, but as a ghost, an archaeologist of her own life. This house, which she had once considered her sanctuary, now felt like a meticulously crafted museum of her own suppression. It was David's house. She saw that now with a clarity that felt like a betrayal of his memory. She started in his study. The room smelled of him old paper leather and the faint, spicy scent of the aftershave he'd used for 30 years. Nothing had been moved since his passing. The massive oak desk was a fortress. She ran her hand over its polished surface, a surface she had dusted 1,000 times but had never been encouraged to use. "Don't you worry your pretty head about the finances, Lizzie," he would say, patting her hand. "That's my job. Your job is to make this house a home." It had always sounded like a compliment, a loving division of labor. Now, hearing his voice in her memory, it sounded like a command, a boundary. She was the Minister of the Interior, yes, but he was the absolute monarch, and her jurisdiction ended at this door. He had loved her, she didn't doubt that. But it was a controlling love, a love that required her to remain small, unassuming, uncomplicated. A beautiful, well-cared-for doll in his perfect dollhouse. She drifted into the kitchen, her domain, or so she'd thought. She opened the pantry, the shelves lined with neat rows of cans and jars. She saw the imported Italian tomatoes David preferred, the expensive olive oil he insisted made all the difference. The brand of coffee he'd declared was the only one worth drinking. Her preferences were ghosts here too. She remembered once years ago buying a different brand of coffee on sale. David hadn't said a word. He'd just quietly gone out the next day and returned with his preferred brand, placing it on the counter in front of the one she'd bought. The message was clear. There was a right way to do things his way, and then there was the wrong way. She had learned over the years to stop having wrong ways. It was simply easier. Her thoughts turned to Sophia. She saw her daughter's face not as the 40-something woman she was, but as a little girl, always looking to her for cues, always eager to please. Sophia had learned the art of compliance at her mother's knee. She had absorbed the family ethos, keep the waters smooth. Don't make waves. Now she was doing the same with Mark. Elizabeth recalled a phone call from a few months ago. Sophia had been crying something about Mark making a risky business deal without consulting her. "He's just under so much pressure, Mum." Sophia had sobbed when Elizabeth gently probed. "Havenwood Prestige Properties is his whole life. I have to support him." "It's your life too, darling," Elizabeth had said softly. "Your money is tied up in it as well." There had been a defensive silence on the other end of the line. "Mark knows what he's doing. He's brilliant. It's not my place to question him. It's not my place." The words ricocheted in Elizabeth's mind now. How many times had she thought that exact phrase about David? She had passed her own chains down to her daughter, gilded and disguised as love and support. And Mark, with his sharp suits and predatory ambition, was a much cruder warden than David had ever been. David's control had been velvet-gloved. Mark's was a mailed fist. She found herself in the hallway, standing before the long mirror they'd hung there decades ago. She truly looked at herself perhaps for the first time since David's death. The grief had hollowed out her cheeks and etched fine lines around her eyes. But there was something else in her gaze today. A flicker. A spark in the deep blue of her irises that wasn't just sorrow. "Your constant negativity," Mark's words. She had assumed he meant her mourning. But now, a different interpretation bloomed in her mind, cold and startling. She thought back over the past year. There was the time Mark had gone on a long rant about a new city council zoning ordinance, and she hadn't just nodded. She'd disagreed. She'd read up on it. She had pointed out a flaw in his logic. He'd looked at her with genuine surprise, then annoyance. "Getting a bit cynical in your old age, aren't you, Elizabeth?" He'd chuckled a dismissal disguised as a joke. Then there was the dinner, where he'd been boasting about a ruthless tactic he'd used to acquire a piece of property. Sophia had looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Elizabeth, however, had spoken up. "That doesn't sound very ethical, Mark." She'd said her voice quiet but firm. The temperature in the room had dropped instantly. Sophia had rushed to smooth it over, changing the subject, but the damage was done. She had offered an opinion, an unsolicited, contradictory opinion. It wasn't negativity. It was personhood. It was the slow, tectonic shifting of a personality that had been dormant for nearly half a century. With David gone, the immense gravitational force of his personality was no longer holding her in a fixed orbit. She was beginning ever so slightly to wobble to find her own trajectory, and they couldn't stand it. Her grief hadn't been the problem. Her healing was. The first green shoots of the real Elizabeth pushing up through the concrete of her old life were what they perceived as weeds in their perfectly manicured lawn. A strange, dizzying feeling washed over her. It was terrifying. But underneath the terror was a profound, exhilarating hum of recognition. She was still in there. The girl she'd been before David, the one with opinions and passions and a sharp, inquisitive mind, she hadn't died. She'd only been sleeping. And Mark's cruel little text message hadn't been an eviction notice. It had been an alarm clock. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday in the second week of January. The sound was so alien in the deep quiet of the house that Elizabeth physically flinched. The Christmas tree was gone, dismantled, and packed away with a cold, detached efficiency that felt nothing like her usual tender ritual. The house was scrubbed clean, austere. The only thing left of the holidays was the ghost of pine scent and the gaping emptiness where the joy used to be. She looked through the peephole. Mark and Sophia. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. Sophia was holding a bouquet of flowers, and even through the distorted glass, Elizabeth could see they were cheap supermarket carnations, their pinks and whites garishly bright against the grey day. An insult wrapped in cellophane. She opened the door. "Mom." Sophia said, her voice breathy and strained. She tried for a bright smile, but it faltered around the edges. "We were just in the neighborhood. We wanted to see how you were." She pushed the bouquet forward. "These are for you." Elizabeth took them. The cellophane crinkled loudly in the silence. She didn't thank them. She didn't invite them in. She simply stood there, waiting. Mark cleared his throat, stepping forward to fill the void. "Elizabeth, look, we know the holidays were tense." He arranged his face into a mask of sincerity, a look she recognized from his business dealings. Things were said or texted that shouldn't have been. It was the stress of the season. You know how it is. She just looked at him, her gaze level. She could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the winter chill. He was nervous. "Good. Can we come in?" Sophia asked, her voice small, pleading. Elizabeth stepped aside, a silent, ungracious gesture. She led them not to the comfortable living room, but to the formal dining room. She placed the cheap flowers in the center of the vast, polished mahogany table, where they looked pathetic and out of place. She remained standing. They took their seats, looking uncomfortable in the stiff-backed chairs. The charade began. Sophia chattered nervously about Chloe, her granddaughter, and her college courses. Mark chimed in with hollow praise for the way Elizabeth kept the house, his eyes scanning the room, not with appreciation, but with an unnerving, calculating appraisal. They were apologies made of air attempts to rebuild a bridge they hadn't just burned, but dynamited. Elizabeth let the silence answer them. Her new, watchful silence. She wasn't the passive, accommodating mother-in-law anymore. She was a scientist, observing a strange and distasteful species. Finally, Mark could bear it no longer. The pretense dropped from his face like a stone. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. The salesman had arrived. "Elizabeth?" He began, his voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial tone. "The real reason we wanted to talk to you, it's about the future. It's about legacy. David's legacy." He slid his briefcase onto the table, the clicks of the latches echoing in the room. He pulled out a glossy brochure. "Havenwood Prestige Properties" was emblazoned across the front in a gold-embossed font. "As you know, my company is on the cusp of something monumental. A new development east of the city. It's a game changer. It's going to redefine luxury living in this state." He spoke in slick, pre-rehearsed sound bites, his passion as artificial as the flowers sitting between them. He talked about profit margins, investment yields, and market projections. He used a cascade of jargon designed to impress and confuse to make her feel out of her depth. She listened, her expression unreadable. She understood more than he thought. In the long, quiet nights since Christmas, she had started reading the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. She was slowly, painstakingly educating herself on the world David had always shielded her from. There's an opportunity, Elizabeth. Mark went on, his eyes gleaming. A once-in-a-generation chance to get in on the ground floor. But to secure the prime land parcel, we need to move fast. The banks are ready to go, but they require a bit more established collateral, a bit more history. He paused for dramatic effect. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a sheaf of papers bound with a clip. He slid it across the polished table. It stopped just before her hands. It was a loan application. She didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. The stark black and white of it, the endless boxes and fine print, screamed its purpose. It's for $1.5 million. Mark said, his voice smooth as oil. A formality, really. The bank just needs a co-signer with a significant unencumbered asset. This house. He gestured around the room. They see this house. They see David's name, his history of financial prudence. It's a golden ticket. Sophia was looking down at her hands, her knuckles white. She was a willing accomplice to her own mother's fleecing. Think of it, Elizabeth. Mark purred, leaning in closer. This isn't just a loan. This is your chance to actively participate, to secure this family's future for generations, to finally contribute in a real, tangible way to the legacy David worked so hard to build. Contribute. The word landed in her heart with the force of a physical blow, as if 45 years of her life, her work, her love, her very being had been intangible, unreal. A prelude to this single defining moment where she could finally be of use by signing her name. The audacity of it was breathtaking. To banish her from their lives, to call her a negative burden, and then not even a month later to appear on her doorstep and ask her to underwrite their entire future. It wasn't just greed. It was a profound, staggering contempt. They saw her not as a person, but as a resource, a key to a vault. She looked from the papers to Mark's expectant face, then to her daughter's averted gaze. Sophia wouldn't meet her eyes. She was ashamed, but her shame wasn't strong enough to make her speak. Her passivity, the trait Elizabeth had unwittingly bequeathed to her, was a cage of its own. Elizabeth said nothing. The silence in the room grew stretched taut like a wire. It was no longer the empty silence of grief or the watchful silence of observation. This was something new. It was the silence of a judge considering a verdict. The heat of her initial pain had cooled, compressing itself into something dense and solid in her chest. It was a cold, hard anger, clear and pure as a diamond. They had come to her house expecting to find a weak, lonely old woman, addled by grief and desperate for their affection. They had miscalculated. They had mistaken her silence for surrender. She slowly raised her eyes and met Mark's gaze. For the first time, he saw something in them that made his own smile falter. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the calm, chilling focus of a storm gathering far out at sea. And in that moment, looking at the loan application that was supposed to be her family's salvation, Elizabeth knew it was a declaration of war, and she had just chosen her side. The silence in the house had changed. Before it had been a comfortable shroud, the quiet hum of a life lived a familiar companion. Now, since Mark and Sophia's visit, it felt accusatory. It was the silence of a tomb, thick with unspoken words, and the ghost of an ultimatum. Elizabeth found herself moving through the rooms of her own home, as if she were a trespasser. The polished wood of the floors seeming to hold the memory of her son-in-law's smug, predatory smile. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a countdown not to an event, but to a decision she was terrified to make. The doorbell, when it rang 2 days later, was a violent slash through the oppressive quiet. Elizabeth startled her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief, paranoid moment, she thought it was Mark returning to press his case. She smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly, and went to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a shock of bright pink hair pulled back in a messy bun, a studded leather jacket, and a face that was a perfect, defiant blend of Sophia's features and Mark's intensity. Chloe. Elizabeth unlocked the door, a wave of relief so potent it almost made her dizzy. Chloe, darling, what a surprise! Her granddaughter stepped inside, bringing with her the crisp autumn air and the scent of clove cigarettes. At 19, Chloe moved with a kind of restless energy, her dark eyes taking in everything at once. She bypassed the formal hug instead, giving Elizabeth's arm a firm squeeze. It was their way, affectionate but never sentimental. I was in the area, Chloe said, her voice a low, gravelly contrast to her mother's melodic tones. Figured I'd check if you were still alive after the Christmas decree. The words were blunt, but there was no malice in them. Only a fierce, protective anger on Elizabeth's behalf. I'm still breathing, Elizabeth managed, leading the way into the living room. Would you like some tea? Got anything stronger? Chloe quipped, dropping her messenger bag onto the floor with a heavy thud. She flopped onto the sofa, long legs in ripped jeans propped up on the antique coffee table. Elizabeth didn't even think to correct her. I'm afraid it's just tea or water, Elizabeth said, her lips twitching into a small smile. Tea it is then. Black, no sugar. Chloe's eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on the empty space on the mantelpiece where the family Christmas photo used to sit. Elizabeth had taken it down yesterday. So they came to see you, didn't they, Mom and Dad? It wasn't a question. Elizabeth paused on her way to the kitchen. She turned back, her smile fading. How did you know? Mom called me, gushing about how you'd had a lovely chat and cleared the air. She only ever uses that tone when she's trying to convince herself of a lie. Chloe pulled a sleek, thin laptop from her bag. And Dad's been weird, jumpy. I saw him on a video call for work yesterday. He was sweating. Elizabeth came back into the room, her errand forgotten. She sat down in her armchair, the one that faced the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sweating. Yeah, Chloe said, her gaze sharp and analytical. And Dad never sweats. Not unless he's about to lose. Big. I saw it once when I was a kid when one of his big resort deals in the Canaries went south. Same look. Same damp upper lip. So I'm going to ask you, Grandma, and I want you to tell me the truth. What did he want? The directness of the question was a shock, but a welcome one. There were no layers of feigned concern, no delicate dancing around the issue. Just the clean, hard edge of the truth. Elizabeth felt a lifetime of practiced evasion fall away. He wants money. She said the words, tasting like rust in her mouth. A lot of money. He and your mother. They want me to co-sign a loan for them. $1.5 million. Chloe's jaw tightened. She didn't look surprised, only grimly satisfied, as if a piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place. Of course. Of course that's what it is. Theatrics first, then the shakedown. First he bans you from Christmas, makes you feel small and alone. Then he shows up with a fake apology and a financial gun to your head. It's classic psychological manipulation. Textbook. Elizabeth stared at her granddaughter. She had never heard Mark's behavior articulated so clinically, so accurately. It was validating. It made her feel less like a sensitive old woman and more like the target of a calculated strategy. He said his company, Havenwood Prestige Properties, is expanding. Elizabeth recited the lie, feeling flimsy and ridiculous, even as she said it. A new venture. Very promising. Chloe let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. Expanding into what bankruptcy, Grandma, his social media, is a dumpster fire of desperation. It's all posts about disrupting the luxury market, and photos of him on yachts that were clearly rented for 2 hours. It's a performance. Anyone with half a brain can see it. She leaned forward, her expression intense. He wants to use this house as collateral, doesn't he? Elizabeth nodded, a lump forming in her throat. That son of a bitch, Chloe whispered, shaking her head. So he exiles you, then tries to steal the roof over your head. The nerve. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Elizabeth's. You can't do it, Grandma. You know that, right? You absolutely cannot sign anything. I know, Elizabeth said quietly. But knowing and doing, they feel very different. He's my son-in-law. Sophia is my daughter. And what about you? Chloe pressed, her voice rising slightly. What about what they're doing to you? Mum just goes along with it. She always has. She sees the shiny life he promises, and she just ignores the rot underneath. Chloe's gaze softened for a moment. Look, I know this is hard. He's got you feeling cornered. That's the point. But you're not alone in this. She tapped a finger on her laptop. I'm a third-year cybersecurity major with a minor in forensic accounting. It's what I do. I live and breathe data. I can find out what's really going on with his company. Discreetly. No one will ever know I was there. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Let me help you, Grandma. Let me look. He's hiding something, and whatever it is, it's making him desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. We just need to find them. An alliance. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For 45 years, Elizabeth had navigated her family's treacherous emotional currents alone. The idea of having an ally, especially this sharp, angry, brilliant girl, felt like a lifeline. But it also meant pulling Chloe into the ugliness, into the heart of her family's dysfunction. I don't want you in the middle of this. Elizabeth said, the protest weak even to her own ears. It's not your fight. He made it my fight when he hurt you. Chloe stated as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. Besides, I can't stand bullies, and my father is a bully. He just hides it behind expensive suits and a country club membership. She gave a small, determined smile. So what do you say, team up? You're the inside source, the one with the history. I'm the digital ghost. Together, we can figure out what he's so afraid of. Elizabeth looked at her granddaughter, the fierce loyalty in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She saw a strength she wished she'd had at that age. She saw a path forward that wasn't just about passive refusal, but about active discovery. For the first time since the text message had arrived, the suffocating weight in her chest lifted, replaced by a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time: resolve. All right, Elizabeth said, her voice firmer now. All right, Chloe, let's find out what he's hiding. A few days later, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the hum of purpose. Chloe had gone back to her dorm, promising to start her digital reconnaissance immediately. Elizabeth, meanwhile, felt a new sense of agency. If she was going to refuse the loan, she needed more than a gut feeling. She needed a reason, a solid, tangible reason. She needed to build a case. The logical place to start was with David's old financial papers. She went to his office. The room was at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. She hadn't been inside it for more than a few minutes at a time since he'd died. It was exactly as he had left it. A fortress of mahogany and leather, smelling faintly of old paper and his cologne. It was meticulously organized, a reflection of the man himself. Or at least, the man she thought he was. A large, imposing desk faced the door. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with leather-bound books on law, finance, and history. To the side, a row of grey filing cabinets stood like soldiers at attention. This was David's domain, a place where he had controlled his world with ledgers and contracts. Elizabeth felt a familiar chill, the feeling of being a visitor in a part of her own husband's life. She started with the filing cabinets. The keys were in the top drawer of his desk, labelled of course. She pulled open the first drawer. Household finances, 1980-1990. Taxes. Insurance. It was all there perfectly categorized. She spent over an hour sifting through folders, her hands growing dusty. She found old mortgage statements, utility bills, car insurance policies. Everything was mundane, normal. There was no hidden debt, no secret accounts, nothing that would justify Mark's desperation or provide a clear reason to refuse him beyond her own financial safety. Frustration began to set in. She was looking for a needle in a haystack, and she wasn't even sure what the needle looked like. She moved from the cabinets to the desk drawers, finding nothing but stationary old checkbooks and paper clips. It was all a dead end. Defeated, she sank into his large leather chair. It squeaked in protest. The room felt oppressive, the weight of his control pressing down on her. Her eyes scanned the shelves, the neat rows of books, the framed photo of a much younger Sophia on the desk. And then her gaze fell on the closet door. She rarely had reason to go in there. It held his old winter coats and a few boxes of things she couldn't bring herself to sort through. On a whim, driven by a growing sense that she was looking in all the wrong places, she got up and opened it. The scent of mothballs and cedar hit her. His heavy tweed overcoats hung in a neat row. On the floor were several cardboard boxes labelled university notes and old photographs. But on the top shelf, pushed all the way to the back, behind a stack of old blankets, was something else. It was a box. No, not a box. It was a ledger. Heavy, bound in dark brown, almost black leather. It was thick, substantial, and had no title or markings on the cover. But it wasn't the ledger itself that made her breath catch. It was the small brass 3-digit combination lock that held it shut. She had never seen it before. In 45 years of marriage, she had never once seen this book. She reached up and carefully pulled it down. It was heavier than it looked, and the leather felt cold, almost sinister in her hands. She ran her thumb over the lock. A simple mechanism, but without the combination, it was as impenetrable as a bank vault. What was this? Why was it hidden? Why was it locked? She took it back to the desk and set it down. It seemed to absorb the light in the room, a dark, silent object, radiating secrets. As she stared at the 3 small dials of the lock, a memory surfaced unbidden and sharp. It was from years ago, maybe 20, maybe more. It was a Tuesday. It was always a Tuesday once a month. A man would come to the house. He never came to the front door. He would park down the street and walk up the driveway to the side entrance that led directly to David's office. Elizabeth had only seen him clearly a handful of times. He was a tall, thin man with a gaunt face and eyes that seemed to carry a perpetual anxiety. David never introduced him. He only ever referred to him on the rare occasion his visit was mentioned as Mr. Vance. Their meetings were always tense. Elizabeth could hear the low murmur of their voices through the thick office door, but never the words. The tone, however, was unmistakable. It wasn't the easy cadence of friends or the formal rhythm of business partners. It was strained, sharp, and secretive. After Mr. Vance left, David would be irritable and withdrawn for the rest of the day, retreating into a silence that was even more profound than his usual quiet. At the time, she had assumed it was some unpleasant business matter, a difficult client, or a contentious negotiation. She had learned early in their marriage not to ask questions about his work. It was his world, and she was not invited. But now, staring at the locked ledger, the memory felt different. It felt significant. The secretive meetings, the tension, the hidden book. They were all connected. This ledger wasn't just old financial paperwork. This was something else. This was the first real clue she had ever found into the life her husband had so carefully, so completely hidden from her. And the key to it all was locked away, behind three little numbers she had no way of knowing. The call from Chloe came 2 nights later. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, staring at the ledger which now sat on the counter like a dark accusation. She had tried guessing combinations. Her birthday, David's birthday, their anniversary, Sophia's birthday. Nothing. "Grandma, you sitting down?" Chloe's voice was tight, all business. "I am," Elizabeth said, her heart beginning to pound. "Okay. So, Havenwood Prestige Properties is a house of cards. A big, shiny, flammable house of cards. It's not just leveraged, it's drowning. He's taken out so many secondary loans and bridge loans against his commercial properties that he's basically paying off debt with more debt. It's a classic Ponzi scheme structure, just a legal version of it. The cash flow is almost non-existent. The financial data I pulled from public records and a few less public databases. It tells a story of catastrophic failure." Elizabeth closed her eyes, picturing Mark's confident smile. A performance. Chloe had been right. His social media is a masterpiece of deception. Chloe continued, a note of grudging admiration in her voice. "Posts about a new office in Lisbon. The address is a virtual mail forwarding service. The team retreat in Aspen. It was him, Mom, and 2 hired models from an Instagram agency. It's all fake. He's projecting an image of success to lure in one last big investor or one last big loan to keep the whole thing from imploding." "The 1.5 million," Elizabeth whispered. "Exactly. It's not for expansion. It's a bailout, a life raft. And your house is the anchor he wants to tie it to." There was a pause, the sound of Chloe taking a breath. "But that's not the weird part." Elizabeth gripped the edge of the counter. There's more, Chloe confirmed. "I got curious about their home network. My parents aren't exactly tech-savvy, but they have a high-end server for data backup media, you know. Dad insisted on it a few years ago. I ran a deep scan on it. Most of it is what you'd expect: photos, financial software backups, pirated movies." Another pause, this one longer, more ominous. "But there's something else. A partition on the main drive. It's hidden and heavily encrypted. Military-grade stuff. It's named contingency. Contingency." The word hung in the air, cold and calculated. "What does that mean?" Elizabeth asked. "It means it's a backup plan. A break glass in case of emergency folder. It's where you'd hide something you never want found unless everything else has gone to hell. I can't get into it. Not with conventional methods anyway. My cracking software just bounces right off it. This isn't protected by a simple password like password 123. This is different. Different how? The encryption protocol suggests the password isn't a random string of characters. It's a word. Or a phrase. Something of deep, deep personal significance. A secret so private, so core to who he is, that no one would ever guess it. It could be a name, a place, a date, a quote. Something that meant everything to him or to whoever created it. The partition was created over 20 years ago, but it's been accessed as recently as last week. 20 years ago. The timeline snagged in Elizabeth's mind. Around the same time as the meetings with Mr. Vance. "So you can't open it?" Elizabeth asked, her gaze falling back to the locked ledger on her counter. Another locked box of secrets. "Not without the password," Chloe said, her frustration evident. "And that's not something I can hack, Grandma. It's something you have to know. It's a key made of memory." Armed with Chloe's damning report, Elizabeth knew she couldn't delay any longer. The image of the contingency folder, a digital ghost on a server, and the cold, hard weight of the ledger on her kitchen counter gave her a terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about a bad business deal. This was about something rotten that went back decades. Her next step was clear. She needed a lawyer. She found one through an old friend from her book club. Arthur Finley was not a slick city lawyer from a glass tower. His office was in a modest brick building on a quiet side street. The paint on his sign faded by the sun. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes, a rumpled suit, and a reputation for being pragmatic and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting his clients. Elizabeth sat across from his cluttered desk, the locked ledger in her tote bag at her feet, like a dormant bomb. She explained the situation in a low, steady voice: the Christmas ban, the sudden visit, the loan request, her granddaughter's findings about Mark's company. She didn't mention the ledger or the contingency folder. Not yet. She needed to know the legal landscape first. Arthur Finlay listened without interruption, making brief notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest, and steepled his fingers. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, his voice calm and measured. "Let me be perfectly clear. From a purely financial standpoint, co-signing this loan would be an act of self-immolation. Based on what your granddaughter has uncovered, and frankly based on the sheer desperation of the request itself, Mark's company is a sinking ship. The moment you sign that paper, you are lashing yourself to him. When it goes under, and it will go under, you go with it. The bank will come for the collateral. They will take your house. You will be left with nothing. It's not a risk. It's a certainty." Hearing it laid out so starkly by a man of the law solidified the fear into a hard, cold fact. "He is counting on your love for your daughter." Finlay continued, his eyes softening with a hint of sympathy. "He is weaponizing your family bond to solve his financial crisis. It's a tale as old as time, I'm afraid. So I just say no," Elizabeth asked, feeling a tremor of fear. "You have your solicitor me draft a formal letter of refusal," he said. "It will state in no uncertain terms that you will not be entering into any such financial agreement. It makes it official. It draws a line in the sand." He paused, his expression turning serious. "But you need to be prepared, Elizabeth. Men like your son-in-law, men who build their lives on illusion, they do not react well when the illusion is challenged. His charm will vanish. He will likely get nasty." The prophecy was fulfilled less than 24 hours after the official email was sent from Arthur Finlay's office. Elizabeth was in the garden, trimming her roses, when her phone rang. It was Mark. She almost let it go to voicemail, but then she remembered Finlay's words. "Line in the sand." She answered, "Elizabeth." Mark's voice was stripped of all its usual warmth. It was flat, cold, dangerous. "I received an email from your lawyer." "Yes," Elizabeth said, her own voice surprisingly steady. "I thought it best to be clear." "Rich?" A humorless laugh crackled down the line. "Oh, this is crystal clear. After everything I have done for this family, for Sophia, for you, after I welcomed you into my home, you banned me from your home for Christmas." Elizabeth cut in the words sharp and clean. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. She had never ever interrupted him before. "That was a misunderstanding." He sputtered, his composure cracking. "A poor choice of words. This is a betrayal. This is you turning your back on your own daughter. This is me protecting the only home I have." She replied, her knuckles white around the handle of her pruning shears. "The home your daughter will inherit one day, provided I don't sign it away to pay for your mistakes." The dam broke. The cold fury erupted into open rage. "My mistakes? You have no idea what you're talking about, you stubborn old woman. This is about the family's future. Our assets." "They are my assets, Mark," Elizabeth said quietly. "Mine and David's." "And you're not fit to manage them?" He snarled, the venom in his voice shocking her. "That's it. That's the problem. You're grieving, you're isolated, you're not thinking clearly, you're becoming confused." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. "What are you saying, Mark?" she asked, her blood running cold. "I'm saying that Sophia and I are worried about you. Deeply worried. We may have to take steps for your own good. We may have to talk to the courts about a conservatorship to protect the family's assets from an elderly woman who is clearly suffering from senility. A judge might see that refusing to help your family, that hoarding resources out of spite, is proof that you're no longer capable of making sound decisions. Senility. The word was a slap in the face. He was going to try and have her declared incompetent, to strip her of her home, her autonomy, her very identity. It was no longer a request for a loan. It was a declaration of war. The charm, the fake apologies, the pretense of family. It had all been a lie, a tool to get what he wanted. Now that it had failed, he was taking off the gloves. Elizabeth said nothing. She simply listened to the sound of his heavy, angry breathing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she ended the call. She stood in the garden, the scent of roses thick in the air. The silence rushed back in, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer the quiet of loneliness or the hush of secrets. It was the calm, electric silence in the moments before a lightning strike. The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time in her life, Elizabeth Sterling was ready to fight. The lawyer's words echoed in the oppressive silence of the house, bouncing off the polished wood and the cold glass of the window panes. Incapable. Unsound mind. A danger to her own financial well-being. Mark wasn't just trying to take her house. He was trying to take her name, her sanity, herself. He was trying to erase her just as David had done for 45 years, piece by piece, until only a polite, smiling silhouette remained. A sudden gust of wind rattled the old window frames of Havenwood, a low moan that seemed to crawl in from the sea. It was the sound of a gathering storm, but the storm was already inside her. The insult, so clinical and cruel, didn't just wound her. It detonated something deep within the bedrock of her memory. It was a pressure she hadn't known she was withstanding, and now it had cracked. Her feet carried her without conscious thought towards David's study. The door was closed, as it always was. But in her mind, it was suddenly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting through the darkness of a night more than 20 years ago. The house had been still then, too. Sophia and Mark had only been married a few months, their new life, a fragile seedling she had hoped to nurture. She had been woken not by a storm, but by voices from downstairs. A low, sharp crack of a voice David's, and then a higher, pleading tone she didn't recognize at first. She'd slipped out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath her feet, a ghost in a silk nightgown moving through her own home. She crept down the stairs, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. The sliver of light from the study beckoned her. Peeking through the crack, the scene resolved itself into a tableau of power and fear. David stood behind his immense mahogany desk, not leaning on it, but commanding the space around it. He was in his silk dressing gown, a portrait of casual authority. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His voice was a blade of ice, and before him, bathed in the glow of the desk lamp, was Mark. A younger Mark, his face pale and slick with sweat, his expensive suit looking cheap and ill-fitting on his slumped frame. The confident, charming young man she knew was gone, replaced by a terrified boy. In David's hand was a thin manila file. He wasn't holding it like a weapon. He was holding it like a fact, an irrefutable truth. It wasn't just a bad investment. Mark, David's voice was low, each word, a carefully placed stone. It was reckless. You got greedy. You used my name with people who don't forgive mistakes. You exposed yourself. And by extension, you exposed me. I can fix it, David. I swear. Mark stammered, his hands twisting in front of him. I just need a little more time, a little more capital. David gave a small, humorless smile. It didn't touch his eyes. No, you've had enough capital and enough time. Your time for making your own decisions is over. He tapped the file with a single manicured finger. The sound was like a gavel falling. This, he said the word, hanging in the air, is a detailed account of your recklessness. The names you used, the corners you cut, the promises you broke. It's a very persuasive narrative. Mark stared at the file as if it were a coiled snake. He looked like he was going to be sick. What What are you going to do? I am going to do what I always do. David said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost paternal, which was far more terrifying. I am going to protect my family. I am going to protect my daughter. He took a slow step around the desk, and Mark flinched. I will cover your losses, this one time. I will absorb your mistake into my own accounts. No one will ever know. Relief washed over Mark's face so profound it was painful to watch. David, thank you. I won't let you down again. No, David said, stopping directly in front of him. You won't. He held up the file. Because this will live here, in my safe. It is my insurance policy. It ensures you will never be reckless with my daughter's happiness again. It ensures you will never be reckless with my money again. It ensures that from this day forward, you are a devoted husband and a diligent, obedient business partner. Do you understand me, son? The word son was the cruelest cut of all. Mark could only nod his throat, working unable to form words. He looked utterly broken. A puppet whose strings had just been handed to a new master. The memory dissolved, leaving Elizabeth standing in the present-day hallway, her hand on the cold brass knob of the study door. The wind howled again, and this time she understood. All these years she had mistaken Mark's resentment for simple arrogance, for a modern man's disdain for his mother-in-law. She had been wrong. It was fear, a deep, abiding terror that had curdled into hatred over 2 decades. He didn't hate her for being negative or old-fashioned. He hated her because every time he looked at her, he saw David's ghost. He hated her because she lived in the house where his soul had been signed away. He wasn't just trying to take her home. He was trying to bulldoze the last monument to his own humiliation. A cold, hard clarity settled over her. She was not just fighting for a house. She was standing in the path of a frightened animal, an animal that had been caged by her husband and was now trying to chew its way out, even if it meant devouring her in the process. The clarity was a brittle thing, and it shattered as the day wore on. It was one thing to understand the source of Mark's hatred, but it was another to live with the new shape of the past. Her marriage, her life with David, was now a landscape she had to relearn. Every memory was suspect. Every kindness he'd ever shown her felt like a transaction. She paced the length of the living room, the Persian rug, a map of a country she no longer recognized. Her gaze kept drifting to the oil portrait of David above the mantelpiece. The artist had captured him perfectly, the confident set of his jaw, the intelligent eyes, the faint, almost imperceptible smile that promised everything and gave away nothing. The man who protected his family. The man who blackmailed his son-in-law into obedience. Her mind snagged on another memory, not a single traumatic event like the one in the study, but a recurring one, a small, polished stone of condescension she had carried for years without understanding its weight. It would happen on evenings when he came home late, smelling of expensive cigars and the cold night air. She, younger, and still believing her role was to be the soft place for him to land, would ask where he'd been. She could picture it now. A Tuesday. She'd made his favorite pot roast. The kids were in bed. She was waiting in the kitchen, wiping down an already clean counter. The sound of his key in the lock. David. You're so late. I was worried. He'd entered the kitchen, loosening his tie, a tired but smug look on his face. He'd walk over to her place, a cool hand on her cheek, and smile that private smile. Business, my dear. Always business. But until midnight, is everything all right? And then he would say it, his voice, a soft, patronizing caress. It's the cost of your beautiful silence, Elizabeth. A small price to pay for this life, for this house, for our children's future. Your peace of mind is what I work for. He'd said it 100 times in 100 different ways. It was his mantra, his justification. And every time it had made her feel infinitesimally small. Her silence wasn't a gift. It was a commodity. Her lack of questions wasn't trust. It was a service she provided for which she was compensated with a lovely home and a comfortable life. He had bought her silence. The cost of your beautiful silence. The phrase hung in the air of the living room, shimmering with a new, venomous meaning. Cost. Money. Silence. The blackmail. It was all connected. Her eyes flew back to the study door. The ledger. The locked leather ledger that Chloe had found, the one with the strange custom combination lock. A jolt went through her, so powerful it was like a physical shock. Adrenaline surged hot and sharp, clearing away the fog of grief and confusion. This was no longer about Mark or even David. This was about her, about the truth of the cage she had lived in. She walked to the study and opened the door. The room smelled of him, old paper leather, and a faint, lingering scent of his cologne. It was a tomb, a museum to a man she was realizing she had never known. She went straight to the bookshelf where Chloe had found the ledger tucked behind a first edition of Moby Dick's. She pulled it out. The leather was dark, worn smooth with time. On the front, there was no title, only a small brass combination lock with 5 wheels, each wheel bearing the letters of the alphabet. It was an artisan piece, something David would have commissioned. Arrogant. Obscure. Her fingers trembled as she held it. The cost of your beautiful silence. He was taunting her even from the grave, a puzzle only she could solve because it was built on her own subjugation. She thought back to his words. What was the most important word in that phrase to him? Cost. Beautiful. No. It was the thing he had paid for, the thing he valued most. Silence. Her breath hitched. With a certainty that felt both insane and completely rational, she began to turn the small brass wheels. Her fingers were clumsy, stiff. S-I-L-E-N. She held her breath and tugged gently on the clasp. It didn't move. A wave of frustration and foolishness washed over her. Of course not. It was a random memory, a cruel phrase. It meant nothing. She was a grieving widow, chasing ghosts, just like Mark wanted the world to believe. She slumped into David's vast leather chair, the ledger heavy in her lap. The chair sighed around her, molding to her shape, but it felt like she was sitting in his lap, a child being tolerated. She stared at the lock again. She had been too literal. David was never literal. He was symbolic. He loved the grand gesture. The cost. What if it wasn't the word? What if it was what the silence bought? She looked around the room at the empire of objects David had assembled. The house, this room, this desk. What was this place called? On the deed, on the mail, on the lips of everyone in town, Havenwood. A safe harbor, a place of peace, a place of silence. Haven. With renewed purpose, she spun the dials again. Haven. She pulled the clasp. A soft metallic click echoed in the silent room. It was the loudest sound she had ever heard. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had locked his secrets away with the very name of the sanctuary he had built for her. The cage was named Haven. The irony was so profound, so quintessentially David, that a dry, rasping laugh escaped her lips. With trembling hands, she opened the cover. The smell of old paper was stronger now, dry and dusty. She expected to see legal documents, affidavits, copies of cancelled checks, the proof of Mark's youthful sins, the leash David held him on. But it was not that at all. The book was filled with page after page of neat, meticulous columns, all in David's sharp, decisive handwriting. It was a ledger, just as it appeared. But the headings were not stocks or bonds. They were source, placement, layering, integration. Dates, amounts, untraceable shell corporations with names like Oceanic Imports and Pine Ridge Holdings, and names. So many names. Near the top of a list, her eyes caught one she knew. J. Vance, Mr. Vance, the man from the hushed meetings. And then she saw it. A series of entries from the late 90s. Next to a transfer of a significant sum to a new entity, there was a notation in the margin, a partner buy-in. And next to it, two initials, MS, Mark Sheridan. She scanned the pages, her mind struggling to process the information. The dates went back years. Mark's name appeared again and again, not as a debtor but as a participant, a recipient of funds, a manager of certain accounts. The floor dropped out of her world. The blackmail memory, the image of a terrified Mark, had been a lie. Or rather, she had misinterpreted it. David wasn't blackmailing a victim. He was disciplining an unruly subordinate. He was reining in a junior partner who had gotten sloppy. Mark wasn't a victim cowering in fear of her husband. He was his accomplice, his protégé. A willing, ambitious partner in a sophisticated, far-reaching money laundering operation for some of Portland's most dangerous people. The entire foundation of her understanding crumbled to dust. The last 20 years had not been a story of a son-in-law terrorized by his wife's father. It had been a story of a criminal partnership. Mark's resentment, his constant chipping away at her, wasn't the lashing out of a victim. It was the bitter impatience of an heir waiting for the old king to die. And now that the king was dead, he was coming for the throne. And the throne was this house. She sat there in the quiet tomb of her husband's study, the evidence of his true life open in her hands. She was not the widow of a shrewd investor. She was the widow of a mob accountant. And her daughter, her sweet Sophia, was married to his apprentice. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a conspiracy. The beautiful silence David had bought for her was paid for with dirty money. And she had lived in the heart of it, oblivious for decades. The room felt cold, the air thin. Elizabeth felt a strange detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching a woman she didn't know turn the brittle, yellowed pages of a dead man's book. The shock had burned away the grief, leaving behind a hollow, ringing void. She had to know. She had to see the bottom of the abyss. She turned the pages backward past the entries detailing Mark's involvement, past the first mention of Mr. Vance, back through the years, searching for the beginning. Every criminal enterprise has a genesis, a first dollar, seed money. Where did David, the son of a failed fisherman, get the capital to start a criminal bank? She found it on one of the very first pages. The paper was older, the ink slightly faded. The page was titled simply, Project Inception Capital. There was a date, October 12th, 1985, an amount $50,000, and a source description that made no sense, SH Life Policy Settlement. Says her. The initials meant nothing to her. She mentally cycled through family names, old friends. Sheridan, no. That was Mark. Smith Jones. Nothing. Her mind felt sluggish, unable to make the connection. SH $50,000. 1985. The year snagged in her memory. 1985. The worst year of her life. The year the silence in Havenwood had truly begun. The year the light had gone out of her world. The year her son, her breath caught in her throat. A sound half gasp, half sob tore from her. Samuel Havenwood. her firstborn, her beautiful, laughing 2-year-old boy. He had died in October of 1985. A tragic household accident, everyone had said. He had slipped through a loose railing on the back porch while she was inside just for a minute answering the phone. A fall. Instantaneous, they told her. Painless. A freak accident. David had handled everything. He had been a rock, a pillar of strength in the tsunami of her grief. He dealt with the police, the doctors, the funeral director. He even dealt with the life insurance policy he had insisted they take out on the whole family just a year before. A morbid necessity, he had called it. When the check for $50,000 had arrived, she couldn't even look at it. It felt like blood money. David had understood. "I'll put it away, Elizabeth." He'd said, his voice thick with what she thought was sorrow. "We'll invest it somewhere. We never have to see it or think about it again. It's tainted." She stared at the ledger at the entry. SH Life Policy Settlement. Tainted money. He hadn't lied about that. Her eyes scanned down the page. Below the entry, in the same cold, precise script, David had written a series of notes. They were not the words of a grieving father. They were the clinical observations of a project manager. Item: porch railing, west side. Pre-weakened support struts 2 weeks prior. Weathering patterns appear natural. Plausible deniability established. Item: back door lock. Mechanism filed to create intermittent failure. Unreliable. Cannot be proven to be deliberately left open. Item: timing. Coincides with neighbors' established afternoon routine. Minimal risk of external observation. Result: successful asset liquidation. Capital acquired. Phase 1 complete. The book slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The world tilted, the walls of the study seeming to bend inward. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. He hadn't just used the money. He hadn't just profited from a tragedy. He had created it. He had stood in her kitchen and watched her cry, had held her, while she shook with grief, had listened to her blame herself, for months, for years, for a single moment of inattention. And he had known. He had planned it. He had murdered their son for $50,000. Her Samuel. He hadn't died in an accident. He was the seed money. A wave of nausea and a rage so pure and white-hot, it felt like it could incinerate her from the inside out, washed through her. She gripped the arms of the leather chair, her knuckles white, anchoring herself against the spinning vertigo of the truth. She forced herself to pick up the ledger. She had to know the rest. She had to know the full depth of the betrayal. She turned the page. A few months after the asset liquidation, there was a new entry, a plan for expansion, and a name. Protégé Selection Mark Sheridan. Ambitious, intelligent, but financially desperate. Unburdened by sentimentality. Ideal candidate. A few pages later, another entry detailed the loan she had witnessed being discussed in the blackmail scene. But the ledger told the true story. Note: capital extended to MS is not a loan, but his formal buy-in. Full disclosure of project inception and capital source provided. He is a knowing and willing partner. His commitment is now sealed not just by ambition, but by complicity. He understands the foundation on which we build. Mark knew. Mark had known from the very beginning. He had courted her daughter, married into her family, and eaten at her table for 20 years, knowing that the foundation of his entire life, his business, his wealth, his marriage to Sophia, was built on the calculated murder of the little boy who would have been his brother-in-law. And now, the final piece of the puzzle slid into place so dark and monstrous it eclipsed everything else. The house. His obsession with the house. Havenwood. It was the first major asset David had purchased after the scheme was flush with cash. It was the first thing bought with Samuel's blood money. It wasn't just about its monetary value. It was the original sin solidified in wood and stone, selling it, mortgaging it, converting it into clean, untraceable numbers on a screen. It was the final act, the final laundering, to erase the origin story forever, to wash away the last physical trace of the boy named Samuel. Suddenly, Elizabeth's mind was completely terrifyingly clear. The encrypted partition on the family server, the one Chloe, with all her technical skill, couldn't crack, the one labeled contingency, the ultimate backup plan, the digital ghost in their machine. She knew the password. It wasn't a clever phrase. It wasn't a string of numbers. It was the one word they had all been forced to bury. The name that was the price of their beautiful, silent life. The foundation. She reached for the phone on the desk, her hand steady now cold as ice. She dialed Chloe's number. Her granddaughter answered on the second ring, her voice bright and worried. "Grandma, are you okay? I've been thinking about what that lawyer said." Elizabeth cut her off. Her own voice was alien to her, a low, flat tone devoid of all warmth. It was the voice of judgment. "Chloe," she said, "I have the password for contingency." There was a pause on the other end. "Grandma, how I tried everything." Elizabeth looked at the portrait of her husband, at the face of the monster she had loved. She looked at the ledger on the floor, the scripture of his sins. The password, she said the word, a shard of glass in her mouth, is Samuel. The line was quiet for a moment. The hum of the digital connection, the only sound spanning the distance between the old house and the city apartment. Elizabeth held the phone to her ear, her knuckles white where she gripped the receiver. She was looking at the ledger open on her desk. David's precise, cold handwriting, a testament to a life built on an atrocity. Chloe Elizabeth's voice was a low whisper, dry as dust. "I'm here, Grandma. The partition is on my screen. It's a fortress. But the password field is open. I'm ready." Elizabeth took a breath. The air in the room felt thin, stolen. She looked at the first entry in the ledger, the one dated just after the funeral. The source of the seed money, the name that had been a forbidden word in this house for 40 years. The name that was the key. "Samuel," she said. Her own voice sounded foreign, a strange echo from a past she was only now beginning to own. On the other end of the line, she heard the soft, rapid clicking of a keyboard, a sharp intake of breath from Chloe. "Grandma? I'm in." Chloe's voice was different now. The excitement of the chase was gone, replaced by something hushed, almost fearful. "Oh God, I'm in." "What is it, Chloe? What do you see?" "Files. Folders. Dozens of them. They're organized by project name. Crestwood Development. Azure Point Holdings. Northgate Properties. It's all here. Spreadsheets, bank transfers, scanned incorporation documents from shell companies. Grandma, this is everything. This is his entire operation. It's a detailed map of how he moves the money. Every dollar." Elizabeth closed her eyes. She could see it, the invisible empire Mark had built, a glittering facade over a rotten foundation. "Keep looking. There must be more. I'm looking—" Wait. There's a separate folder. The name is Insurance Policy. Chloe's clicking stopped. What the hell, she murmured more to herself than to Elizabeth. "There are audio files in here. Lots of them. The file names are just dates and initials. J.V. Jacob Vance. Play one," Elizabeth commanded, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. A moment of silence. Then a sound crackled through the phone. A voice that was almost Mark's, but distorted, digitally manipulated. It was talking about moving funds, covering tracks, referencing specific account numbers from the spreadsheets Chloe had just seen. But then another voice joined, one Elizabeth didn't recognize. Chloe's voice cut through the recording, frantic. "I'm cross-referencing the initials. J.V. Jacob Vance. He was Mark's primary business partner for a decade. They had a massive falling out last year. a really ugly public split. Mark accused him of embezzlement. Vance countersued, claimed Mark was setting him up. It was a mess, but it just faded away. Nobody could prove anything. Mark was creating evidence. Elizabeth breathed the cold logic of it settling in her stomach like a stone. He was building a cage for Vance, ready to lock him in it if everything started to collapse. It's more than that, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a shocked whisper. These aren't just recordings, Grandma. They're deep fakes, expertly crafted. He's used Vance's real voice from interviews, from voicemails probably, and woven it into conversations that never happened. He's putting his own crimes into Vance's mouth. He was going to sacrifice him, just feed him to the wolves to save himself. The parallel was so stark, so hideously perfect, it stole Elizabeth's breath. A different sacrifice, a different generation, but the same cold-blooded calculus. David had sacrificed his son for $50,000 and a clean start. Mark, his heir in spirit and in crime, was ready to sacrifice his partner to protect an empire built on that very same sin. The inheritance was not of wealth, but of wickedness. Chloe Elizabeth said, her voice now unnaturally calm. Is it possible? Could you use these files? The raw data of the voices. Use them for what they're designed to frame Vance. I know. But you have Mark's voice. You have the template. You have the technical blueprint for how he did it. Could you create something new? The line was silent for a long count. Elizabeth could hear the gears turning in her granddaughter's sharp mind. The horror, the understanding, the reluctant dawning of a terrible, brilliant idea. Grandma Chloe said finally, her voice low and grave. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to help me set a trap. Elizabeth replied, her eyes fixed on the name in the ledger. I'm going to host one last family meeting. The phone call to Mark was the performance of her life. She pitched her voice to sound weary, defeated. The querulous tone of an old woman who had fought her last battle and lost. Mark, she'd said, a slight tremor in her voice. I've been thinking. You were right. This house, it's too much for me. And I don't want to be alone. She could practically hear the smirk forming on his face, transmitted through the line. I knew you'd come around, Elizabeth. It's for the best. You'll see. His tone was magnanimous, the benevolent victor. I've reconsidered your offer. She continued, hating every syllable. The loan. If it will help you and Sophia, I'll do it. I'll sign. There was a brief, surprised silence. He hadn't expected a full capitulation so soon. Well, that's wonderful news. Truly. I'll get the documents drawn up with the bank. We can have this all sorted by the end of the week. No, Elizabeth said a little too quickly. She softened her tone. Come tomorrow. To the house. Bring Sophia, bring Chloe. I want to do this as a family. We can sign the papers here, at the dining room table, where we used to have Sunday dinners. It was the perfect bait. An appeal to a sentiment he had never possessed, but was an expert at feigning. It stroked his ego, painting him as the magnanimous patriarch reuniting his fractured family. Of course, Elizabeth, he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. Whatever you want. We'll be there around 7. The following day passed in a strange, suspended reality. Elizabeth moved through the house, not as its resident, but as a stage manager preparing for a final tragic performance. She didn't clean. She cleared. She polished the long mahogany dining table until it gleamed like dark water, imagining the pristine white loan documents spread across its surface. She took down a few family photos from the mantelpiece, smiling happy lies captured on film, and placed them in a drawer. The house needed to be a courtroom, not a home. Chloe arrived in the late afternoon, her face pale, a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't say much. She simply entered the living room, found the discreet Bluetooth speaker they had agreed upon, and placed it on the bookshelf, partially hidden behind a collection of David's old leather-bound classics. She connected her phone, tested it once with a soft chime, and then sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The two women waited in near silence, the air thick with unspoken words, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. At precisely 7, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth smoothed the front of her simple black dress and went to the door. Mark and Sophia stood on the porch, bathed in the golden light of the dusk. Mark was beaming, holding a sleek leather briefcase. He was dressed in an expensive suit, a peacock displaying his victory. Sophia stood slightly behind him, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. She clutched a bottle of wine, a peace offering. Elizabeth Mark boomed, stepping inside and kissing the air beside her cheek. "You look wonderful. A new chapter, eh? Hello, Mark." "Sophia." Elizabeth's voice was level. She took the wine from Sophia's hand and placed it on a side table unopened. "Chloe is in the living room. Let's go to the dining room, shall we?" Mark strode ahead, all confidence and swagger. He placed his briefcase on the gleaming table and clicked it open with a flourish, pulling out a thick sheaf of papers. "Here we are." The bank was incredibly accommodating. "A few signatures from you right here and here, and we can put all this unpleasantness behind us." He spread the documents out the pages, filled with dense, incomprehensible legal text. A contract for her own destruction. He pushed a pen towards her. Sophia moved to stand behind him, a supportive hand on his shoulder, her eyes pleading with Elizabeth to just sign to make it all okay again. Elizabeth didn't look at the papers. She didn't look at the pen. She looked past Mark, her gaze landing squarely on her daughter. Sophia, her beautiful, broken Sophia, who had lived her entire life in the shadow of a lie she never even knew existed. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mark's smile was fixed, waiting. Elizabeth drew a slow breath. "Sophia," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "Do you remember your brother?" The question hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. The smile on Mark's face didn't vanish. It froze. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning vibrant flesh to cold wax. His entire body went rigid. Sophia blinked, confused. My brother. What are you talking about, Mom? I never had a brother." "Oh, but you did," Elizabeth said, her voice remaining eerily calm. "His name was Samuel. He would have been 45 this year. He died when he was 5. A tragic accident, they said. He fell down the basement stairs." Mark finally found his voice. It was a choked, strangled sound. "Elizabeth, what is this? What are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" "I've found it, Mark. After 40 years, I've finally found it." She turned her gaze to him, and for the first time he saw not a frail old woman, but something ancient and immovable. "You were there that day, weren't you? You came over for dinner. David sent you to the store to get ice cream. A specific brand he knew they didn't have, just to get you out of the house for an hour." Mark's face, which had been pale, began to flush with a deep, mottled red. "This is insane. You're delusional. Sophia, your mother is having some kind of episode. We need to call her doctor." Sophia looked from her mother's unnerving calm to her husband's rising panic. "Mom, please. What is this about? Just sign the papers. Let's not fight anymore." There was no fight. Elizabeth said, her voice slicing through Sophia's plea. There was a transaction. It was logged meticulously. On August 14th, 1985, 2 days after Samuel's funeral, a life insurance policy was cashed, $50,000. On August 20th, a down payment was made on this very house, Havenwood, the first asset in a portfolio that would be built over decades. She recited the details from the ledger, her memory perfect. The dates, the amounts, the chillingly neutral language David had used to document the conception of his criminal enterprise, funded by the death of his own child. Mark slammed his hand on the table, making the papers jump. Enough! I will not stand here and listen to these vile, senile ramblings. You are a bitter, lonely old woman, and you're trying to poison your own daughter against me because I wouldn't let you ruin another Christmas. He turned to Sophia, his voice pleading, desperate. Soph, look at her. She's lost it. She's inventing monsters because she's angry. It's what she does. It's her negativity. Sophia was trembling, her eyes wide with a terrible conflict. She looked at her mother, whose story was so insane, so monstrous, it couldn't possibly be true. And she looked at her husband, whose denial was suddenly too loud, too violent. Elizabeth gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Chloe, who had been sitting silently in the shadows of the living room archway. And then a new sound filled the room. A voice. A young man's voice, imbued with a familiar, confident arrogance. It was Mark's voice, but from decades ago. So the policy paid out. No questions asked. Another voice answered, older, colder. David's voice. Clean as a whistle. An absolute tragedy. The community has been so supportive. Mark froze his head, snapping towards the sound, towards the bookshelf in the living room. His mouth fell open. Young Mark's voice continued, chillingly pragmatic from the speaker. And the 50,000 is enough for the initial investment, David's voice answered. It's enough. It's the seed. We'll bury it deep in the foundation of the first property. No one ever looks at the beginning. They're too dazzled by the end result. The Samuel project was a complete success. Sophia made a sound. It was not a word. It was a raw, primal noise that seemed to be ripped from the deepest part of her soul, a scream of a reality, disintegrating of a life built on a lie of a love story that was actually a horror story. She staggered back away from Mark, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes fixed on him with dawning, absolute revulsion. What? What is that? She whispered, her voice shattering. It's a deep fake. Mark snarled, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. They manufactured it. It's a trick, a lie, but it was too late. The seed of truth planted by Elizabeth's words had been watered by the audio, and it had bloomed into hideous certainty on Sophia's face. In that exact moment, as Sophia's scream died in the suffocating silence, another sound intruded. Sharp, authoritative knocking on the front door. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Then the splintering crash of the door being forced open. Heavy footsteps thundered into the hall. Men in dark uniforms, vests emblazoned with police, flooded into the room, their movements swift and practiced. Mark Peterman, a detective in a plain suit, called out, his eyes already locked on his target. You're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He held up a file. We have a sworn statement from your former partner, Jacob Vance, and we received an anonymous package this morning containing some very illuminating financial records. Mark didn't even seem to hear him. He was staring at Elizabeth, his face a grotesque mask of hatred and disbelief. As two officers moved in, taking his arms and forcing them behind his back, his world, so carefully constructed, crumbled into dust. The aftermath was a blur of brutal efficiency. Mark was read his rights, his furious, impotent denials, swallowed by the cold professionalism of the officers. He was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit, now just the costume of a common criminal. A female officer gently tried to guide Sophia towards a chair, but she was catatonic, her eyes vacant. She was no longer in the dining room of her childhood home. She was adrift in the wreckage of her life. When her gaze finally fell upon Elizabeth, it was not with gratitude or relief. It was with a void-like emptiness that was somehow more painful than hatred. You, Sophia whispered, her voice hollow. You knew. You let me live with him. You let me love him. You let me have a child with him. You watched us. All these years. She took a step back as if Elizabeth were contaminated. You didn't do this for justice. You did this to burn it all down. You destroyed everything. Sophia, I... Elizabeth began, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? That she hadn't known until a few weeks ago that she had been a prisoner too. It sounded like an excuse even to her own ears. Sophia shook her head, a single tearless sob escaping her lips. She turned and allowed the officer to lead her away out of the house without a backward glance. The bond, stretched thin over years of secrets and resentments, had finally snapped. Chloe came to Elizabeth's side, her small hand finding her grandmother's, a silent anchor in the chaos. But Elizabeth felt nothing. No triumph, no vindication. Just a vast, cold, hollow emptiness where her family used to be. The investigation into Mark's empire was swift. The ledger and the digital files from the contingency folder were an unshakable foundation for the prosecution. But it didn't stop there. Fueled by the evidence of the Samuel Project, the cold case of a 5-year-old boy's accidental death was officially reopened. The sins of the father were finally being visited upon the son. Elizabeth sold the house. The process was quick, impersonal. She took no furniture, no keepsakes, no photographs. She signed the papers in a lawyer's sterile office and walked away from Havenwood, the monument to her silent suffering, without ever looking back. She left the town that had been her cage for nearly 50 years. The money from the sale sat in a bank account untouched. She didn't want a peaceful coastal retreat or a chic city apartment. She didn't want a reward. Weeks later, found her not on a sun-drenched beach, but in the fluorescent-lit basement of a community centre in a town where no one knew her name. The chairs were cheap plastic, arranged in a circle. The coffee was weak. She sat among strangers, men and women, with tired, haunted eyes that mirrored her own. A support group for bereaved parents. When it was her turn to speak, her hands resting in her lap were trembling. The facilitator gave her a gentle, encouraging nod. For 40 years his name had been a secret, a ghost she was forbidden to acknowledge. Saying it aloud felt like a transgression, a rebellion, and a homecoming, all at once. She lifted her head, her voice shaking but clear, breaking a silence that had lasted a lifetime. "My son's name was Samuel," she said to the circle of broken hearts, "and I am finally ready to remember him." It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of reclamation. She hadn't won a house or a fortune. She had won back her son's memory, and in doing so, she had finally won back her own soul. What part of Elizabeth's journey resonated with you the most? The silent suffering, the slow awakening, or the final act of justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you believe true strength really looks like.